High above a darkening city, on a great rock of pale stone, a temple of white marble stands open to the evening sky, its tall columns worn smooth by the winds of 2,500 years, still holding up the broken remains of a roof. Let the world grow quiet around it, and let me tell you the story of the people who raised it. A small, quarrelsome, sunlit people who, in a few short centuries on this dry and rocky land, invented very nearly the world we still live in. Not the pyramids of Egypt, not the great empires of the East. It is here, on these stony hills and on 1,000 islands scattered across a wine-dark sea, that so much of what we now call the West was first dreamed into being. It begins with a hard and beautiful country. Bare gray mountains and small green valleys, olive trees twisted with age, and everywhere the sea. Never more than a day's walk away, glittering in blue and crowded with islands. The Greeks were never one nation under one king. They were scattered among hundreds of small, fiercely proud cities, divided by mountain and water, and yet, somehow, together they shared one language, one family of gods, and one long and extraordinary story. It begins with a blind old poet, or so they said, singing of a great war beneath the walls of Troy, of Achilles and Hector, of a wooden horse and a burning city, the oldest and greatest songs in the Western world, held in memory for centuries before they were ever written down. It begins with the gods, a great and quarrelsome family of them, upon a cloud-wreathed mountain, Zeus with his thunder, gray-eyed Athena, bright Apollo of the sun, as human in their loves and their jealousies as the people who dreamed them. Here, in a dusty open square beneath the temple rock, ordinary men once gathered to raise their hands and vote, and gave the world a startling new idea, that a city might be ruled not by a king, but by its own people. They called it democracy, the rule of the people. Here an old man wandered the marketplace, asking simple, maddening questions: what is justice? What is good? How should a person live? And taught the world to think by teaching it, first, how little it truly knew. Here, on a hillside of stone seats open to the sky, thousands sat in the sunlight and watched the first plays ever written, and wept and laughed at masks and words that can move us still, 2,500 years later. Here, every 4 years, the wars themselves fell silent, and men ran and wrestled and raced their chariots in honor of the gods, the first Olympic Games, in a quiet sacred valley called Olympia. And here too were the Spartans, a whole city made into an army, who raised their sons to feel no fear, and who, with a few hundred men, would one day hold a narrow mountain pass against an empire, and so pass forever into legend. For this small and squabbling world would face the largest empire on earth, the Persians in their countless thousands, and against all reason and all odds, would turn them back and save the fragile new idea of a free city. And from its wild northern edge would come a young king named Alexander, who in a single short life would carry the Greek tongue and the Greek gods to the very rim of the known world, to Egypt, to Babylon, to the far mountains above India, before dying at just 32, with the whole world still open before him. They called their land Hellas and themselves Hellenes. We know them by a Roman word, as the Greeks. And tonight, we will walk slowly through the whole of their long story, from the first ships upon the wine-dark sea to the last quiet evening of their freedom. We will watch cities rise and turn upon one another and fall. We will meet poets and lawgivers, philosophers and tyrants, warriors and wanderers, and hear how, out of this small and sunlit land, came so much of what we still are. There is no need to hurry through any of it. This is a story made for the soft edge of sleep. If it brings you some comfort, you might subscribe and let a new story come to you each night, but only if it truly helps you rest. There is no need otherwise. So settle in and make yourself warm and let your eyes grow heavy, and we will begin at the very beginning, long before the temples and long before the poets, with the sea and the first ships upon it. Begin with the sea. To understand the Greeks, you must first understand the sea, for it shaped them more than any king or god ever did. It is called the Aegean, a warm, blue, island-strewn sea between two coasts, so scattered with land that a sailor is almost never out of sight of some gray shape on the horizon. The land itself is poor and hard. Thin soil, little rain, mountains that cut each valley off from the next. There was never room here for a single great kingdom watered by one great river, as in Egypt or the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Instead, there were many small places, each looking outward to the water. And so the Greeks became a people of the sea. They grew olives and vines on the terraced hillsides, and when they wanted grain or metal or timber, they took to their ships and went to find it. The sea was their road, their marketplace, and their teacher. Long, long before the temples, 5,000 years ago and more, small dark ships already crossed these waters, carrying obsidian, the black volcanic glass that could be flaked into blades sharper than any bronze, traded from island to island by people whose names we will never know. On the little islands of the Cyclades, in the heart of the Aegean, these early people carved figures out of pure white marble, slender, folded-armed figures, their faces almost blank, serene, and strange. We do not know what they meant. They have watched over the dead in silence for 4,500 years. This is the deep past, the time before history, when there was as yet no writing in these lands and no cities worth the name, only villages of stone and mud above quiet harbors, and the slow, patient turning of the seasons and the sea. But far to the south, on the largest of all the islands, something extraordinary was beginning to stir. The island was Crete, long and mountainous, lying across the mouth of the Aegean like a great breakwater against the open sea. And on Crete, some 4,000 years ago, there rose the first true civilization of European soil, a people of wealth and grace and mystery, whose story the later Greeks would only half remember and turn into legend. They built no walls around their towns, for the sea was their wall, and their painted ships were their army. They grew rich on trade, and they filled their days, it seems, with color and festival and the worship of a great goddess whose name we have lost. We call them the Minoans, after a king they may never have had. And to walk into the heart of their world, we must go down into the great house that stood at the center of it. A house so vast and so bewildering that it would haunt the imagination of Greece forever after. It stood near the northern coast of Crete, at a place called Knossos. Not a fortress, but a palace, a sprawling, many-storied maze of hundreds of rooms, opening one into another around a great central courtyard, rising and falling with the slope of the land. There were staircases and light wells, storerooms and workshops, and long corridors that turned and turned again. To a simple villager from the mainland, wandering into it, it must have seemed a place with no end and no plan, a labyrinth from which one might never find the way out. Its walls were painted in bright, joyful colors. Dolphins leaping through blue water, blue monkeys and birds, slender youths gathering flowers, ladies with dark curling hair and gentle smiles, watching some festival we can no longer see. And everywhere the sign of the bull. On Crete, the bull was sacred and terrible, and their most astonishing art shows young men and women vaulting clean over the horns and backs of charging bulls. A dangerous, beautiful game whose meaning is long lost. From this came one of the oldest and darkest of Greek legends, the tale of the Minotaur, a monster half man and half bull, hidden at the heart of the labyrinth, to whom young Athenians were sent as tribute, until the hero Theseus went down into the maze and did not come back out defeated. Beneath the legend lies a memory of a mighty island power to which the small towns of the mainland once paid tribute, sending their sons and daughters across the water in fear to a palace they could not understand. For the Minoans were, for a time, the masters of these seas. Their ships traded with Egypt and with the coasts of the east. Their goods have been found across the whole eastern Mediterranean. They wrote in a script we still cannot read, in signs pressed on clay, keeping the accounts of a wealthy and orderly world. And then, in a single generation, that world was shaken to its roots. Far to the north, on the little island of Thera, a volcano that had slept for centuries tore itself apart in one of the greatest eruptions the world has ever known, burying a whole Minoan town in ash and sending waves and darkness across the sea. Crete did not die at once, but it was weakened and shadowed, and slowly a new power was rising to take its place, not on the islands, but on the rugged mainland to the north, among a harder and more warlike people who had learned the Minoans' arts and would turn them to war. On the mainland of Greece, in a stony land they called the Peloponnese, there stood a citadel upon a hill, guarded by walls of stone so huge that later Greeks believed no mortal men could have raised them, only the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants. The place was called Mycenae, and it has given its name to a whole age. These were not the gentle, sea-loving Minoans. The Mycenaeans were warriors and kings, buried with their weapons and their gold. When their graves were opened in our own age, out of the earth came bronze swords and cups of gold and thin masks of beaten gold laid over the faces of the dead. One such mask, grave and bearded, its eyes closed in the long sleep, is the most famous face to survive from that whole lost world. The man who found it believed, wrongly, that he had gazed on the face of a king from legend. But the awe he felt was not misplaced. These were the lords of a heroic age. From their hilltop fortresses, Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos of the sandy shore, these kings ruled the small plains below, gathering grain and oil and wool into their storerooms, and keeping careful count of it all in an early, clumsy script we now call Linear B. And when at last, after long labor, that script was read in our own century, it gave up a quiet marvel, the names of the gods. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena. Already 3,300 years ago, the Greeks were praying to the very gods they would still honor 1,000 years later. These Mycenaean lords loved war and the sea and plunder. In their swift ships they raided the coasts and islands, trading where they could and seizing where they could not, ranging east toward the rich cities of Asia and the treasures of the Hittite kings. And it was in one such distant venture, remembered and magnified and sung for centuries afterward, that the whole age would find its everlasting story, a great expedition of the Greek kings, sailing east together against a wealthy city that guarded the straits between two seas. The city was Troy, and whether the war was fought for a stolen queen, as the poet said, or for gold and trade and the control of the narrow water, as we might guess, some long, hard siege there seems truly to have been, dimly remembered across the centuries of darkness that followed. For this bright and warlike world was already near its end. Across the whole eastern Mediterranean, in a single terrible age, the great kingdoms fell one after another, cities burned, palaces emptied, whole peoples took to the roads and the sea. We still do not fully know why. The mighty walls of Mycenae stood, but the kings within them were gone. The storerooms fell silent. The art of writing itself was forgotten, and would not return to Greece for 400 years. A great darkness settled over the land. But before we follow the Greeks down into that darkness, we must first hear the story they carried through it, the story that kept them warm. For however dim the true war may have been, out of its memory the Greeks made the greatest story they ever told. The tale of Troy, sung by wandering poets from father to son, growing richer and deeper with every generation, until it became the very soul of their people. It began, they said, with a quarrel among the gods, and a golden apple marked for the fairest. And a young Trojan prince named Paris asked to judge which of three goddesses was the most beautiful, a choice no mortal could make and hope to live in peace. He chose Aphrodite, goddess of love, for she had promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. But that woman, Helen, was already the wife of a Greek king. And when Paris carried her away to Troy, the kings of Greece swore a great oath, and gathered their 1,000 ships and sailed. For 10 long years they besieged the high walls of Troy and could not take them. And the greatest of all the Greek warriors, Achilles, swift, golden, and doomed, sat in anger by his ships, nursing a bitter quarrel with the high king Agamemnon, while his countrymen died. This is where the oldest poem begins, not with the start of the war, but with that anger, the wrath of Achilles, and with the terrible price it exacts. For it is a poem less about glory than about loss, and about the strange, aching tenderness that men can feel even for the enemies they must kill. Its most unbearable moment is not a battle but a meeting, when old King Priam of Troy comes by night, alone, into the tent of the man who has killed his son Hector, and kneels and kisses the hands of Achilles, and begs for the body of his boy. And the two of them, enemies, weep together for all that war destroys. Troy fell at last, the poet said, not by strength but by a trick. The great hollow horse of wood, left as a false gift, with armed men hidden in its belly, and the city taken in the night and burned, and its people led away. So ended the age of heroes in fire. And the second great poem tells of the long road home, of one man, Odysseus, the cleverest of the Greeks, trying for 10 more years to sail back to his small rocky island, and the wife and son who wait for him, driven off course by storms and monsters and his own restless mind. The one-eyed giant in his cave, the witch who turns men into swine, the song of the sirens, the whirlpool, and the six-headed beast. These are the oldest adventures in our literature, and the truest of them all is the simplest. A tired man, far from home, longing only for the smoke of his own hearth. These two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Greeks knew almost by heart. They were their history and their scripture, their book of manners and their mirror. To become a Greek, in a sense, was to grow up inside these stories. And they were composed or gathered or given their final shape by a poet the Greeks called Homer, of whom we know almost nothing at all. But between the fall of the heroes and the singing of Homer lay a great gulf of silence. For centuries we still call the Dark Age, when the palaces lay in ruins and the population fell, and the fine arts of the Bronze Age were forgotten, and the very memory of writing was lost. It was not empty. In the small, poor villages of those years, people still herded their sheep on the hillsides, still married and mourned, still gathered around the fire on winter nights. And there, in the firelight, the old stories were kept alive by voice alone, passed down and polished for 400 years. And in this quiet, patient dark, two things were happening that would remake the world. The first was iron. The old bronze had needed rare and distant tin, but iron lay everywhere in the hills, and a people who learned to smelt it could arm not just a handful of lords, but a whole village of ordinary men. The second was the alphabet. From the Phoenicians, the great traders of the eastern coast, the Greeks borrowed a handful of little signs for the sounds of speech, and then did something no one had done before. They added signs for the vowels and so made the first true alphabet in which anything at all could be written down. It was a small thing, a merchant's tool, a row of scratches on a clay pot. But it meant that writing was no longer the secret art of palace scribes. Any child could learn these 30-odd signs in a season. Reading, for the first time in human history, could belong to everyone. And almost the first thing the Greeks chose to write down, in this new and wonderful alphabet, was poetry, the old songs of Troy and of the wandering Odysseus, set at last into the fixed and shining shape in which we still have them. Whether one blind poet named Homer truly made them, or many singers over many years, no one can say, and the Greeks themselves argued about it. But someone, somewhere around the time the alphabet came, gave these poems their final form, and in doing so, gave the Greeks a common past to share. For that is what the poems did. A man from Sparta and a man from far-off Sicily might never have met, might speak in different accents, might worship at different shrines, but both had wept for Hector, both had longed with Odysseus for home. The stories made them one people. Another poet of those early days, a hard-handed farmer named Hesiod, sang of humbler things, of the gods and how they came to be, and of the honest year of work on a stony farm, when to plow, when to sail, when to rest. Between them, Homer and Hesiod gave the Greeks their gods, their heroes, and their sense of themselves. And now, out of the long darkness, the Greeks were waking. The villages were growing. Ships were sailing farther. People were meeting in the open square to argue and to trade. Something new was being born on those stony hills, small and stubborn, and destined to change everything. It was called the polis, the city-state. A polis was not a great capital sprawling over a plain. It was a small thing, a town and the fields and villages around it, close enough that a farmer could walk in of a morning, often no larger than a single valley, with a few thousand citizens who mostly knew one another's faces. At its heart were two places. On a high rock stood the Acropolis, the high city, a place of refuge and of the gods, crowned with their temples. And below, in the open, lay the agora, the marketplace and meeting place, where men came to buy and sell, to gossip, and more, to decide together how they should be ruled. For this was the strange and fertile thing about the polis. It belonged to its citizens. A Greek did not think of himself as the subject of a king, but as a member of a city, Athenian or Corinthian or Theban, sharing in its worship, its wars, and its quarrels, with a stubborn pride that would never quite die. In the earliest days, kings still ruled these little towns. But slowly the kings faded, and power passed to the noble families, the men with the broad estates and the fine horses, who alone could afford the bronze armor of war. For a time, the aristocrats ruled the best men, as they liked to call themselves. Then came a change on the battlefield that would change everything in the city too. War was no longer a matter of a few heroes dueling like Achilles. Now the citizens fought shoulder to shoulder in a dense line, the phalanx, each man's shield guarding the man beside him, all pushing forward as one. These citizen soldiers were the hoplites, named for the great round shield, the hoplon, that each carried on his left arm. They were not nobles but ordinary men, farmers, potters, merchants, who could afford a spear, a shield, and a bronze helmet, and who trained to stand firm in the line and not to run. And a man who stands in the battle line to defend his city, shoulder to shoulder with his neighbors, will not long be content to be ruled like a servant. If he risks his life for the polis, he begins to feel the polis is partly his. In the phalanx, quietly, the seed of a new idea was planted. But the road from the rule of the nobles to the rule of the people was long and often violent. In city after city, the poor grew angry, crushed by debt, sold into slavery for what they owed, shut out of power by the proud few. The little towns seethed with hatred between rich and poor. And in that anger, again and again, a single strong man would seize his chance, some bold noble who took the people's side, or pretended to, and made himself sole master of the city. The Greeks had a word for such a ruler, a word that has come down to us heavy with fear. They called him the tyrant. Not all tyrants were cruel. Some gave their cities peace and roads and splendid temples, and broke the grip of the old noble families forever. But the Greeks came to hate the very idea of one man ruling over free men, and out of that hatred, in one restless and brilliant city above all, they would reach at last for something the world had never seen. But before we come to that city, look outward for a moment to the sea. For while the polis was being born at home, the Greeks were also spilling out across the whole Mediterranean world in one of the great migrations of history. The land was poor and the people were many, and a city with too many hungry sons would gather them together, consult the gods, and send them off in ships to found a new city on some distant shore, a daughter city, free and independent, but forever tied to its mother by blood and by memory. And so the Greeks went everywhere. They settled the coasts of Sicily and southern Italy so thickly that the Romans would later call the whole region Greater Greece. They founded a city by a quiet harbor in the far west that would one day be called Marseille. They sailed east and north into the Black Sea, planting cities along its shores to trade for grain and gold and fish. They founded a town on a narrow strait between two continents, Byzantium, that would one day, under another name, become the greatest city in the world. Everywhere they went they carried the same things. The same gods, the same games, the same poems of Homer, the same little alphabet, the same passion for the open marketplace and the free city. A Greek in Spain and a Greek by the Black Sea would still know one another as brothers. And everywhere they traded. Greek painted pottery, first bold with black figures on red clay, then finer still with red figures on black, has been dug up from Russia to France, carrying the wine and oil of Greece to every coast, and bringing back grain and metal and slaves. It was trade, too, that gave them one more gift from the East, coined money. From the kingdom of Lydia in Asia, the Greeks took the idea of little stamped discs of silver, each worth a fixed and trusted amount, and money spread through the Greek world like fire, quickening trade and unsettling the old order of land and birth. And in the bustling Greek towns of the coast of Asia, Miletus above all, richest and most restless of them all, a few curious men began, for the very first time, to ask a strange new kind of question. Not what do the gods will, but what is the world actually made of and why? They were the first philosophers, the first scientists, men who guessed that the world might be explained not by the whims of the gods but by causes we could reason out for ourselves. One said all things were made of water, another of some boundless stuff, another taught that the world was ruled by number. They were often wrong. But the question was everything. To that question, in time, we shall return. Now we come to the two cities whose long rivalry would shape the whole story of Greece, as unlike each other as two cities could be. The first lay in a broad valley of the southern Peloponnese, ringed by mountains, without walls, almost without fine buildings. It was Sparta. Sparta had solved the great Greek problem of rich and poor in the harshest way imaginable. Long before, it had conquered its neighbors and made an entire people its slaves, the Helots, who worked the land in their thousands so that every Spartan citizen might be free to do one thing, and one thing only, to be a soldier. For the Spartans lived always in fear, the fear of the vast enslaved population beneath them, who far outnumbered their masters and hated them. And so they made of their whole society a single armed camp, forever on guard, disciplined and hard and closed against the world. A Spartan belonged to the state from birth. A weak or sickly infant, it is said, was not allowed to live. At 7, a boy was taken from his mother and given to the state to raise, in packs under harsh masters, taught to endure cold and hunger and pain without complaint, to obey instantly, and to fear nothing but disgrace. They were taught to speak little and to the point, a habit we still call laconic, after their homeland of Laconia. They were kept always a little hungry and encouraged to steal food to survive, and punished not for the theft but for being caught. Everything was aimed at making them tough, silent, and utterly obedient. They ate together in common messes, plain black broth and hard bread, even the 2 kings who led them in war. They wore their hair long and their tunics plain. They were forbidden to trade, to farm, to work at any craft, for all such things were done by slaves, and a Spartan's only trade was war. And they were, without question, the finest soldiers in Greece. Where other cities' armies were farmers who trained a little, the Spartans trained always and thought of nothing else. On the day of battle they came on slowly, in perfect step, in their scarlet cloaks, unafraid, and the sight of them was often enough to break an enemy's heart before a blow was struck. A Spartan mother, it was said, handed her son his shield as he left for war with a single hard command, to come back carrying it as a victor or carried upon it as a corpse, but never to throw it away and run. To lose one's shield was the deepest disgrace a Spartan could know. It was a strange and terrible way to live. A whole people who gave up art and comfort and freedom and family and every softness to become perfect instruments of war. They wrote no philosophy and built no beautiful temples. They left behind them almost nothing but their legend. And yet that legend was immense. All Greece looked on Sparta with a kind of awed unease, admiring its order and its courage, fearing its power, and quietly glad that there was only one such city. For the Spartans asked nothing of the world but to be left alone in their valley, and to be acknowledged the bravest of the Greeks. That acknowledgement they would earn, one unforgettable day, at a narrow pass in the north. But their great and opposite, the city that would outdazzle all the rest, and give the world its ideas instead of its fears, lay to the north and east, on a dusty plain beneath a great rock by the sea. It was Athens. Athens too had known its troubles, the same old Greek sickness of rich against poor. By 600 years before our era, the small farmers of Athens were sinking into debt, and many had been seized and sold into slavery for what they owed. The city stood on the edge of open war between the classes. And then, instead of a tyrant, the Athenians did something wiser. They chose one trusted man, a poet and traveler named Solon, and gave him the power to remake their laws, and Solon used it not to enrich himself, but to heal his city. He wiped away the crushing debts at a stroke. He forbade forever the selling of any Athenian into slavery for debt, and even bought back some who had been sold abroad. He would not take the land from the rich and give it to the poor as the poor wanted, but he gave every citizen, however humble, a voice and a vote in the assembly of the people. It did not solve everything, and Athens still passed through years of strife, and even for a time under a tyrant named Pisistratos, who, as it happened, ruled mildly and adorned the city, and had the poems of Homer written down in full. But the seed Solon planted did not die. And a generation later, another Athenian, a nobleman named Cleisthenes, took the next great step. To break the old power of the noble families forever, he tore up the ancient tribes based on birth and blood, and mixed the whole citizen body together into 10 new tribes, drawn from every part of the city and the countryside. Now a man's place in the city depended not on who his father was, but simply on where he lived and that he was a citizen. Rich and poor, noble and common, were shuffled together and made to serve side by side. It was a quiet revolution, and it gave to the world a new word and a new thing: democracy, the rule of the people. And it was ruled by the people in a way we can scarcely imagine today. There were no professional politicians, no distant parliament. The citizens themselves, all of them, thousands at a time, gathered in the open air on a bare hillside called the Nix, and there debated the business of the city and decided it by a show of hands. War and peace, taxes and treaties, the building of temples and the sending of fleets, all were argued out before the whole people, and any citizen might stand up and speak. The officials of the city were chosen mostly by lot, like a jury, on the daring idea that any citizen was fit to help govern for a year. It was not perfect, and we should not pretend it was. Women had no vote and no public voice. Slaves, who were many, had no rights at all. And a citizen meant only a free adult man of Athenian blood, perhaps a third of the grown people of the city. By our lights, it was narrow. And yet, set beside every other government in the world at that time, beside the god-kings and the great empires where one man's word was law and all others were subjects, it was a thing of wonder. A city where free men ruled themselves, argued in the open, and bowed to no master but the law they made together. The Athenians were fiercely, joyfully proud of it. And they would soon have the chance to prove, on the field of battle, what free men fighting for their own city could do against the servants of the greatest king on earth. For out of the east, vast and slow and irresistible, the storm was already gathering. But before the storm breaks, let us pause on this quiet edge of sleep to walk among the gods, for no picture of the Greeks is complete without them, and they were never far from any Greek's mind, in the field, in the market, or at sea. The Greek gods were not remote and perfect. They lived, it was said, on the cloud-capped heights of Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in the land, and they were gloriously, alarmingly human. Beautiful and immortal, but jealous, amorous, quarrelsome, and quick to anger, meddling endlessly in the affairs of men. Zeus was their king, lord of the sky and the thunderbolt, forever chased about by the fury of his wife Hera. Gray-eyed Athena, born from his own head, was goddess of wisdom and of clever war, and the special guardian of her city, Athens. Poseidon, his brother, ruled the sea and shook the earth. Bright Apollo drove the sun and gave men music, healing, and prophecy. His sister Artemis roamed the wild woods with her bow. Golden Aphrodite was desire itself. Swift Hermes was the messenger and the trickster, the guide of travelers and of the dead. And dark Hades ruled below, in the gray land of the shades, where all must one day go. The Greeks did not worship these gods with inward prayer and holy books, as later ages would. They worshipped them with festival, with processions and songs, with games and feasting, and above all with sacrifice. The sharing of a fine ox or goat, its smoke rising to the gods, its meat roasted and eaten by the whole community together. And when a man wished to know the will of the gods before some great step, a marriage, a voyage, a war, he might make the long journey to Delphi, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the most sacred place in all Greece, where the god Apollo was believed to speak. There, in the shadow of the great temple, a priestess sat above a cleft in the rock and spoke the god's answers in words strange and clouded, which the priests set into verse. Her replies were famously double-edged, a warning to any who thought the future could be bought cheaply or read too plainly. And there was one place, above all, where the scattered and quarrelsome Greeks came together and remembered that they were one people. In a green and sacred valley of the western Peloponnese, called Olympia, they held, every 4 years, the greatest of their festivals in honor of Zeus. For those few days, a sacred truce was proclaimed across all Greece, and the wars were laid down, and men came from every city and every distant colony to watch the finest athletes run and wrestle, box and throw, and race the thundering chariots. To win at Olympia was the highest glory a Greek could know, worth no money, only a simple crown of wild olive and undying fame. These were the Olympic Games, first held, the Greeks believed, more than 2,700 years ago, and held without a single break for over 1,000 years. They bound the Greeks together in peace as surely as war and rivalry drove them apart. But now the peace was ending. Out of the east, the great king was coming. Far to the east, beyond the Aegean and beyond the Greek cities of the Asian coast, there had risen in a single lifetime the largest empire the world had yet seen. The empire of Persia, stretching from the borders of India to the sands of Egypt, ruled by a king so mighty that he was called simply the Great King, the King of Kings. Under his sway lived the Greek cities of the Asian coast, Miletus and the rest, and they chafed under it. And when at last they rose in revolt, they sent across the sea to ask the free cities of the mainland for help. Most refused. But Athens, young in its democracy and bold, sent ships. The revolt was crushed, and the proud city of Miletus was burned. But the great king Darius had marked the insolence of the little city across the sea that had dared to send aid against him. It is said he had a servant whisper in his ear at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." And so, some 10 years into the 5th century before our era, a Persian fleet crossed the Aegean to punish Athens, and landed its army on a wide plain on the coast north of the city, a plain whose name would ring down the ages. It was called Marathon. The Athenians marched out to meet them, some 9,000 citizen hoplites, joined by a small and faithful band from the little city of Plataea, and no one else. They had sent to Sparta for help, but the Spartans, bound by a religious festival, would not march until the moon was full. Athens would have to face the great king's army almost alone. For days the two armies watched each other across the plain, the Athenians few, the Persians many. And then the Athenian generals made a bold and desperate choice. Rather than wait to be overwhelmed, they would attack, charging the length of the plain, at a run, straight into the center of the greatest empire on earth. They thinned their center and strengthened their wings, and came on faster than any Greek army had ever charged. The Persian arrows fell among them. Their center bent and gave ground, but their strong wings swept the Persian flanks, then turned inward and caught the enemy's best troops in a closing trap by the shore. It became a rout. The Persians broke and fled for their ships in the shallows, and the day was won, an astonishing, unlooked-for victory. A few hundred Greeks had fallen. The Persian dead, they said, were many thousands. Free men, fighting for their own soil, had thrown back the servants of the great king. And then, the story goes, a single runner was sent racing the 26 miles back to the anxious city, to bring the news before the fleet could sail round and find Athens undefended. He ran the whole way without stopping, gasped out one word, "Rejoice, we have won," and fell dead of his effort. From his run we take the name of our longest race. Marathon was a small battle as battles go, but its meaning was vast. It proved that the great empire could be beaten, that free citizens could stand against a king's slaves and win. The Athenians would count it, forever after, their proudest hour. But the Persians would come again, and next time not with a fleet, but with the whole gathered might of Asia, led by the great king himself. 10 years passed, and the old king Darius died, and his son Xerxes took the throne, and Xerxes swore to finish what his father had begun, and to swallow Greece whole. For years he gathered his forces from every corner of his vast empire, until he had assembled the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen. It was so vast, the Greeks said, that it drank the rivers dry. Xerxes bridged the very strait that divides Asia from Europe with boats lashed together, and marched his countless host across into Greece, his fleet shadowing the army along the coast. Before this flood, city after city gave up and offered earth and water in surrender. But not all. At a meeting of the free cities, a band of them swore to resist, Sparta and Athens the chief among them, old rivals standing now side by side. And they chose to make their first stand at a place where the Persian numbers would count for little, a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea in the north called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. There the coast road pinched to a track only a few yards wide. And there a small Greek force, led by the Spartan king Leonidas with 300 of his fellow Spartans at its core, took its stand to hold the pass, to buy time for the rest of Greece to gather against the endless army of the king. For 2 days they held. In that narrow place the Persian numbers were useless. Only a few could come on at once, and the Greeks in their heavy bronze armor cut them down and held the line, and threw back even the king's own royal guard. Xerxes, watching from his throne above, is said to have leapt to his feet 3 times in fear for his army. But the pass was betrayed. A local man, for a price, showed the Persians a hidden path over the mountains, by which they could come down behind the Greeks. And when Leonidas learned at dawn that he was surrounded, he sent the bulk of the Greek army away to safety, and stayed with his 300 Spartans and a few who would not leave to hold the pass to the end. They knew they would die, and they died, fighting to the last, the Spartans keeping their ancient vow never to yield or flee. Over their grave the Greeks set a simple stone with words that have never been forgotten. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Thermopylae was a defeat. The pass was lost, and the Persian host poured south, and took Athens itself, and burned its temples on the sacred rock. The Athenians had abandoned their city, sending their families to safety across the water, trusting to a strange word from Delphi that spoke of a wooden wall that would save them. The wooden wall, one man had argued, a bold Athenian named Themistocles, could only mean their ships. For in the years since Marathon, Athens had built a great fleet, and now she staked everything upon it. The Greek ships gathered in the narrow strait between the mainland and a little island called Salamis, in sight of their burning homes. The Persian fleet was far larger, and Xerxes, certain of victory, set his golden throne on the shore to watch his ships destroy the last defiance of the Greeks. But Themistocles had chosen the narrow water with care, for there, as at the hot gates, great numbers could not spread out, and only turned to a hindrance. In the crowded strait, the huge Persian fleet fell into confusion, ship fouling ship, unable to bring its numbers to bear, and the Greek ships, lighter and better handled and fighting for their very homes, drove in among them and shattered them. By evening the sea was full of wreckage, and the pride of the great king's navy was gone. Xerxes, his fleet broken and his supply lines threatened, turned and went home to Asia, leaving an army behind him. The next year that army too was destroyed at Plataea by the united Greeks with the Spartans at their head. The impossible had happened. The little quarrelsome cities of Greece, standing together, had thrown back the greatest empire on earth. And now, saved and victorious, Athens would rise to a height of glory that the world still remembers. For the 50 years after the Persians were driven back were the most brilliant that any Greek city ever knew, the golden age of Athens, when a single small city, in a single lifetime, produced such a flowering of art and thought and beauty as the world had rarely seen before or since. It began in triumph and in leadership. Athens, with her great fleet, took command of a league of Greek cities banded together to guard against any Persian return, and to free the Greeks of the Aegean coast. The allied cities paid into a common treasury. Athens supplied the ships and the admirals. But slowly, and not always gently, that alliance of free cities became something more like an empire, with Athens as its mistress, and the tribute of the allies flowing into her harbor. It made Athens rich and powerful beyond any other Greek city, and it sowed a resentment that would one day help to ruin her. Over these years there rose one man who came to embody the age and gave it his name. Pericles, a nobleman by birth but a democrat by conviction, who led Athens not as a king but by the sheer force of his wisdom and his eloquence, being elected year after year to guide the city he loved. Under Pericles, the democracy reached its fullest flower. Poor men were paid for their service on the juries and in office, so that even the humblest citizen could afford to take his turn in governing. The whole people, more truly than ever before or since, ruled the city with their own hands. And Pericles resolved that Athens, at the height of her power, should be made the most beautiful city in the world, a fit crown for the Greeks, and an everlasting monument to what free men could achieve. He took the treasure of the League, to the anger of the allies, and with it he rebuilt the temples the Persians had burned upon the sacred rock. On the flat summit of the Acropolis, the high rock at the city's heart, the finest architects and sculptors of the age set to work. And there rose, in gleaming white marble, the most perfect building of the ancient world, the great temple of Athena, the guardian goddess, the Parthenon. It was a marvel of quiet genius. To the eye it seemed all straight lines and simple order, but there is scarcely a straight line in it. Every column swells and leans by a hair's breadth. Every step curves gently upward at the center. 1,000 tiny corrections, so that the whole should look, to the human eye, utterly and serenely perfect. Within it stood a towering statue of the goddess in gold and ivory. Around it, carved in marble, a great procession of the city's people wound in stone, horsemen and elders, maidens and musicians, moving forever toward their goddess. It was the city's own image of itself, offered up to heaven. And below the temples the life of the city hummed and roared. The crowded agora, the law courts, the harbor of the Piraeus thick with the masts of ships from every sea, the workshops and the wine shops, the endless Athenian talk and argument and gossip that Pericles said was the very breath of a free city. Our city is an education to all Greece, Pericles told the Athenians in a great speech over their war dead. A city where men were free and equal before the law and governed themselves and loved beauty without softness and wisdom without weakness. It was a proud boast. But it was also very nearly the truth. And nowhere was that spirit more alive than in the great open-air theaters, where the Athenians gathered to look upon themselves. For it was here in Athens, in these very years, that one of the greatest of all human arts was born almost from nothing. The drama, the play, the telling of a story not by a single singer, but by living actors upon a stage before the gathered people of the city. It grew at first out of religion, out of the wild songs and dances at the festival of Dionysus, god of wine and of the vine and of sacred madness. Then someone, a man named Thespis, the Greeks said, from whom we still call actors thespians, first stepped out of the chorus to speak alone, as a character, and the play was born. The Athenians built great theaters for it, curving tiers of stone seats cut into a hillside, open to the sky, holding many thousands, gathered around a round dancing floor and a stage. And once a year at the festival the whole city came, rich and poor together, to watch the new plays compete for the prize. The tragedies were drawn from the old myths, Troy and Thebes, and the doomed houses of the heroes. But the poets used those ancient stories to ask the deepest questions of their own day. about justice and the gods, about pride and suffering, about what a human being owes to the city, to the family, and to the truth. Aeschylus, the eldest, who had himself fought at Marathon, wrote of great crimes and their long punishment, and of how, out of the endless cycle of blood for blood, a city might at last rise to something better, the rule of law and the mercy of the court replacing the ancient vengeance. Sophocles, serene and perfect, wrote of proud and noble souls broken upon a fate they could not escape, of Oedipus, the king who solved every riddle but the riddle of himself, and destroyed himself in his very search for the truth. And of Antigone, the young woman who defied a king's command to honor her dead brother, and chose death rather than betray what was holy. Euripides, the youngest and the strangest, turned a colder, more questioning eye upon it all, upon the cruelty of the gods, the madness of war, and above all the sufferings of women and the outcast, whom the older poets had scarcely seen. He unsettled his audience, and they did not always love him for it, but the ages after have never forgotten him. And there was laughter too. The comedies of Aristophanes were wild, bawdy, and fearless, mocking the politicians, the philosophers, the generals, and the follies of the war, by name and to their faces, before the whole assembled city. In no other place on earth could a poet so freely ridicule the powerful. It was the very freedom of Athens, laughing at itself. 25 centuries later, we still stage these plays. We still weep for Antigone and shudder for Oedipus. In a few short decades, in one small city, the theater was born whole and nearly perfect. But the same restless, questioning spirit that filled the theater was also loose in the streets of Athens, in the person of one strange, ugly, barefoot old man, who would change the history of thought forever. His name was Socrates, and he was, by his own cheerful account, the ugliest man in Athens, snub-nosed, pot-bellied, and shabby, going barefoot through the city in a single worn cloak, winter and summer alike. He wrote not a single word in all his life. And he is one of the most important human beings who ever lived. For Socrates had turned philosophy in a wholly new direction. The old thinkers of Asia had asked what the world was made of. Socrates cared nothing for that. He asked about us, about how a human being ought to live. What is goodness? What is courage, or justice, or friendship? What does it truly mean to live well? And his way of asking was strange and maddening. He claimed to know nothing at all and simply asked questions. He would stop a confident general in the agora and ask him, ever so humbly, what courage was, and then, with question after gentle question, show the great man that he did not really know what he thought he knew. He did this to everyone, to politicians, to poets, to famous teachers of wisdom, stripping away their false certainties one by one, until they stood confused and often angry, and a crowd of delighted young men looked on. He was, he said, like a gadfly, sent by the god to sting a sluggish city awake, and never to let it rest in comfortable ignorance. He taught that no one does wrong on purpose, that we do evil only out of ignorance of the good, and that if we could truly know what was right, we would do it. He taught that it is better to suffer wrong than to do it. And he taught, above all, that the unexamined life is not worth living, that to be human is to question. He asked for no fee and founded no school. He simply talked all day with anyone who would talk with him in the marketplace, at the gymnasium, at dinner. And around him gathered the brightest young men of Athens, who loved him, and who would carry his questions down through all the centuries that followed. But he made enemies. The powerful do not like to be made to look foolish before laughing crowds. The pious did not like his endless questioning of everything, and Athens, as we shall see, was soon to fall on hard and bitter and frightened times, in which such a restless questioner would come to seem not a gift, but a danger. For the golden age could not last. Even as the Parthenon rose and the theaters filled and Socrates strolled and questioned, the seeds of ruin were already growing. Athens had grown too great, too proud, too grasping, and across the mountains, the other great power of Greece watched her rise with a deepening and deadly fear. Sparta looked on the swelling empire of Athens, and the tribute flowing into her harbor, and the walls she built, and was afraid. And the lesser cities, chafing under Athenian power or fearing it, looked to Sparta as their shield. Slowly, inexorably, the Greek world was dividing into two great camps, drawn up against each other. And at last the long dread broke into open war, the most terrible war the Greeks had ever fought, not against a foreign king, but against themselves, the long, ruinous struggle between Athens and Sparta, and between all the cities that took one side or the other. They would tear the golden age to pieces with their own hands. It is called the Peloponnesian War, and it lasted, with pauses, for 27 years, a war between the greatest sea power and the greatest land power of the Greek world, each unable to strike a fatal blow at the other, each grinding on until both were exhausted and one lay ruined. Sparta and her allies were supreme on land. Their army could march into the fields of Athens and no one could stop them. Athens was supreme at sea. Her fleet ruled the waters and could strike anywhere along the coast, and bring in food and tribute from across her empire. It was a war of the elephant against the whale. Pericles' strategy was cold and clear. Let the Spartans burn the fields. The people of the countryside would shelter behind the great walls of the city, which ran all the way down to the sea and the harbor, so that Athens, fed by her ships, could never be starved out. Let Sparta rage on the land. Athens would win by patience and the sea. It might have worked. But in the second year of the war, with the whole population of the countryside crammed behind the walls, a terrible plague broke out in the crowded city, some sickness we still cannot name, and swept through the packed streets, killing perhaps a third of all the people of Athens. The dead lay in the streets and the temples. The living lost heart, and law and decency broke down in the face of so much death. And among the countless dead in the third year of the plague was Pericles himself, the one man whose wisdom and authority had held the restless democracy on its steady course. After him, Athens fell into the hands of lesser men, clever, ambitious demagogues who flattered the people and led them into rasher and crueler ventures, and who lacked all of Pericles' patience and restraint. The war ground on year after bloody year, with truces made and broken, and neither side able to win. And it grew crueler as it went. In the passions of the long struggle, the old restraints fell away. Whole cities that rebelled or fell were treated with a new and dreadful harshness. The men killed, the women and children enslaved. The historian who lived through it, Thucydides, set it all down without flinching, so that later ages might understand how war corrupts even the noblest of peoples. For Thucydides watched his own brilliant city, the school of Greece, coarsen and harden under the strain, watched wisdom give way to recklessness, and honest speech to slogans, and moderation come to seem like cowardice. His grave, unsparing history is the first attempt ever made to understand war and politics not through the gods, but through the unchanging nature of men. Then Athens, restless and overreaching, made the great blunder of the war. Tempted by a brilliant, reckless young leader named Alcibiades, she sent an enormous expedition far across the sea, to the west, to conquer the rich and distant Greek city of Syracuse, in Sicily, and win an empire in the west. It was a catastrophe. The great expedition, badly led and far from home, was trapped and slowly destroyed beneath the walls of Syracuse. The mighty fleet was lost, the huge army was broken, and the survivors were driven into the stone quarries to die of thirst and sun, or sold into slavery. Athens lost, in one far-off adventure, the flower of her strength. She reeled, but she did not fall, not yet. For years more she fought on with a stubborn, desperate courage, building new fleets, winning battles even now, refusing to yield. But her treasury was draining, her allies were falling away, and her enemy had found, at last, the one thing that could beat her at sea. For Sparta had done the unthinkable. She had gone to the old enemy, Persia, and taken the great king's gold, Persian silver, to build a Spartan fleet, so that the land power might at last challenge Athens on the water. The Greeks who had once united to throw back Persia were now taking Persian money to destroy each other. And so, worn down at last, her fleet finally trapped and destroyed on a distant shore, her food cut off and her people starving behind their long walls, Athens could fight no more. After 27 years, the great city surrendered. The victorious Spartans and their allies debated whether to destroy Athens utterly, to raze the city, kill the men, and sell the rest, as Athens herself had done to others. In the end they spared her, but they pulled down her great walls to the sound of flute girls, and burned what was left of her fleet, and put an end to her empire and her glory. For a time, a cruel little band of pro-Spartan oligarchs seized power in the broken city and ruled by terror, until the Democrats rose and drove them out and restored the democracy. But it was a chastened, frightened, poorer Athens now, bitter in defeat, suspicious and quick to blame. And in that anxious mood, it turned upon its wisest man. Socrates was now an old man of 70, still barefoot, still asking his questions in the marketplace as he always had. But some of those questions had come to seem dangerous, for he questioned the democracy itself, and some of his old companions had been among the traitors and tyrants who had betrayed the city. To a frightened Athens, the old gadfly began to look like an enemy. And so they brought him to trial on a vague and terrible charge, that he did not believe in the gods of the city, and that he corrupted the young men of Athens with his questioning. A jury of 500 citizens gathered to judge him. He would not beg or weep or bring his children to soften them, as accused men usually did. Instead, he defended his whole life, telling them that the god had set him over Athens like a gadfly on a noble but sluggish horse to sting it awake, that he had only ever tried to make men care for wisdom and goodness above wealth and power, and that he would sooner die than give up asking his questions. It was too proud for them and too sharp, and they were afraid. By a narrow margin, the jury found him guilty and condemned him to death, to drink a cup of poison, the juice of hemlock. His friends arranged everything for his escape. The guards would have looked away. But Socrates refused to run. He had lived his whole life, he said, as a citizen under the laws of Athens. He would not now break those laws to save his own skin, merely because their judgment had gone against him. To do wrong to escape a wrong done to him would betray everything he had ever taught. And so he stayed. On his last day, his friends gathered around him in the prison, weeping, and he comforted them, talking calmly to the very end about the soul and whether it might outlive the body, and telling them not to grieve. Then, when the sun was low, he drank the poison without a tremor, and lay down, and spoke a few last quiet words to his friends, and died. Athens had killed the best man in the city. But she could not kill his questions. For among the young men who had loved him and stood weeping at his death was one who would never forget, and who would spend his whole long life setting down what his master had taught and building upon it, a nobleman named Plato. Plato was heartbroken and disgusted by the city that had murdered his teacher, and he gave up all thought of the political life he had been born to. Instead, he devoted himself to philosophy, to the questions Socrates had asked, and he wrote them down not as dry lectures but as living conversations, with Socrates himself as the hero of nearly every one. So it is that we know Socrates at all, through the dialogues of Plato, in which the old questioner walks and talks forever, drawing his friends toward the truth. And through these dialogues, Plato went far beyond his master, building a whole vision of reality, of the soul, and of how men ought to live and be governed. He taught that behind this shifting, imperfect world our senses show us, there lies another, truer world, a realm of perfect and eternal forms, of beauty itself and justice itself and goodness itself, of which all the beautiful and just and good things around us are only dim and passing shadows. The philosopher's task was to turn away from the shadows and toward the light. He told a famous story to explain it, of prisoners chained in a cave since birth, who see only shadows thrown on the wall before them, and take those shadows for the whole of reality, until one is freed and turns and climbs painfully up into the blazing sunlight of the real world outside, and sees, for the first time, the truth. And Plato founded a place to pursue these things, a school in a grove outside Athens, sacred to a hero named Academos, from which we take our word, academy. There, for centuries after his death, men gathered to study philosophy and mathematics and to carry on the search. Over its door, it was said, were the words, Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. And to that academy, as a young man from the north, came the third of the great Athenian philosophers, the pupil of Plato, as Plato had been the pupil of Socrates, a doctor's son named Aristotle, who may have been the most powerful single mind the ancient world ever produced. Where Plato looked away from this world toward a higher one, Aristotle turned back to this one, and set out, almost single-handed, to understand the whole of it. He studied and wrote upon very nearly everything: the stars and the weather, animals and plants, poetry and drama, ethics and politics, logic and reason itself. He was the first great collector of facts, the first to observe and classify the natural world with patient care, dissecting animals, gathering constitutions, laying down the very rules of logical argument that we still use today. For nearly 2,000 years afterward, across many lands and faiths, he would be known simply as the philosopher, the master of those who know. He taught that the good life was a life of balance and reason, that virtue lay in the middle path between too much and too little, and that happiness was not pleasure or wealth but the full and active use of our highest powers, the flourishing of a human being living well over a whole lifetime. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, teacher, pupil, and pupil's pupil, 3 generations in one small city, between them laid the foundations of Western philosophy so deep and so wide that nearly all who came after have been, in a sense, only their students. And Aristotle, in his turn, would become the teacher of a boy in the north who would conquer the world. For while the great cities of the south, Athens and Sparta and Thebes, had worn one another out in endless wars, jealous and divided and unable ever to unite, a new power had been quietly rising on the wild northern edge of the Greek world, in a rough kingdom of horsemen and highlanders called Macedon. The southern Greeks looked down on the Macedonians as half-barbarians, rude, hard-drinking country cousins who spoke a rough dialect and were ruled, still, by kings. But those kings claimed descent from Pericles and from the heroes of Homer, and they longed to be counted among the true Greeks, and to lead them. And then Macedon found a king of genius, Philip II, who came to a weak and threatened throne as a young man and made of his backward kingdom, in 20 years, the greatest military power Greece had ever seen. He was a brilliant general, a cunning diplomat, and utterly relentless. He remade the Macedonian army into a terrible new machine. He armed his foot soldiers with a pike far longer than any spear, the sarissa, some 15 feet long, and drilled them to fight in a deep bristling block, a hedge of points that no ordinary phalanx could come near. And he paired it with the finest heavy cavalry in the world, his noble companions, to strike the decisive blow. With this army, and with bribery, and with patient guile, Philip extended his power steadily southward, swallowing his neighbors, buying traitors, and picking off the divided Greek cities one by one, while they quarreled among themselves and were slow to see the danger rising in the north. In Athens, one great voice saw clearly and cried out warning after warning against him, the orator Demosthenes, the finest speaker Athens ever produced, who thundered against Philip year after year, begging the Greeks to wake and unite before it was too late. His speeches against the northern king are still models of fierce and burning eloquence. At last Athens and Thebes did unite, too late, and marched out to stop him. And on the field of Chaeronea, Philip and his army crushed the combined might of the old cities, and with that single battle, the age of the free and independent city-state, which had lasted for centuries, came quietly to its end. Henceforth the Greeks would follow the king of Macedon. Philip did not enslave the beaten cities. He bound them into a league under his own leadership and then announced his grand design, the dream that would unite all Greeks behind him at last. A great war of vengeance against Persia, to free the Greeks of Asia and to punish the old enemy for the burning of Athens long ago. But Philip would never lead that war. At the height of his power, as he prepared to march east, he was struck down and murdered at a wedding feast by one of his own guards, for reasons still argued over. And the throne of Macedon, and the great army, and the dream of conquering Persia, all passed in an instant to his son, a young man of 20 named Alexander. Alexander had been raised for greatness. His mother told him he was descended from Achilles, and he carried a copy of the Iliad with him everywhere, and slept with it beneath his pillow beside a dagger. His father had given him the finest teacher in the world, Aristotle himself, who taught the boy philosophy, medicine, and the love of Greek learning. As a boy, they said, he had tamed a great black horse that no grown man could ride, named Bucephalus, by seeing what others had missed, that the beast was only afraid of its own shadow, and turning it toward the sun. That horse would carry him to the ends of the earth. His father, watching, wept with pride and told him Macedon was too small for him. He came to the throne at 20, amid enemies and revolts, and crushed them all with a speed that left Greece stunned. Then, with his father's superb army and his father's great dream, and scarcely any money, he crossed into Asia to make war on the Persian Empire, the same vast empire that had once sent its fleets against Marathon and Salamis. He was hopelessly outnumbered. The Persian Empire was 100 times the size of his kingdom. But Alexander had the finest army in the world, and a genius for war that has never been surpassed, and a reckless personal courage that made his men follow him anywhere. He always led the charge himself at the very front, and shared every danger and every hardship of his soldiers. At a river called the Granicus, he won his first great victory and freed the Greek cities of the Aegean coast. Then, at Issus, in a narrow plain by the sea, he met the great king Darius himself with a huge army, and broke it and sent the king fleeing from the field, leaving his own mother, wife, and children behind in the Macedonian camp. Alexander treated the captured royal women with perfect courtesy and honor, as befitted their rank, and refused twice the king's offers of half his empire and a princess for peace. His companion Parmenio said he would accept, were he Alexander. "So would I," Alexander answered. "Were I Parmenio, he would have all of it or nothing." He turned south first to secure the coast and marched into Egypt, where the people, who hated their Persian masters, welcomed him as a liberator and a pharaoh and a son of the gods. There, on the western mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city and gave it his own name, Alexandria, which would become, in time, the greatest city of the Greek world. Then he turned at last into the heart of the empire to finish it. On a wide plain called Gaugamela, Darius awaited him with the whole gathered host of Persia, hundreds of thousands strong, scythe chariots and war elephants and the levies of 100 nations, on ground he had chosen and leveled for his numbers. Alexander, far outnumbered, watched and waited, and then found his moment, leading his companion cavalry in a headlong wedge straight through a gap in the Persian line, driving for the great king himself. And once again Darius, seeing death bearing down upon him, turned his chariot and fled, and his great army, seeing their king flee, broke and dissolved. The empire was Alexander's. He entered Babylon in triumph, and then the great Persian capitals, and took the vast treasure of the great kings hoarded over 2 centuries, wealth beyond counting. At Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, the splendid palace of the kings was burned, whether by drunken accident or cold revenge for the burning of Athens long before. Darius himself, fleeing ever eastward, a king without a kingdom, was murdered at last by his own despairing followers. Alexander found the body and covered it with his own cloak, and had the last great king buried with royal honor, and took upon himself the title and the majesty of the King of Kings. He was now, at 25, the master of the greatest empire the world had ever known, from the Adriatic to the mountains of the east, richer and mightier than any man alive. He might have stopped and ruled and grown old in glory. But Alexander could not stop. Something in him always looked to the next horizon and the lands beyond the edge of the map. And so he led his army on ever eastward into lands the Greeks had only dreamed of, over deserts and terrible mountains, through the passes of the Hindu Kush, into the wild countries of Central Asia, fighting hard wars against fierce peoples who would not be conquered for years on end. He was changing as he went. He began to dress in the robes of a Persian king, and to take on the ceremonies of the East, and to ask that men bow low before him as the Persians bowed before their kings. He married a princess of the eastern mountains, Roxana, for love, it was said. And his old Macedonian companions, who had bled for him, grew uneasy and resentful at these foreign airs. For Alexander had a great and strange dream, not merely to conquer the East, but to fuse it with the West, to join Greek and Persian into one people, one ruling class, one shared world. He enrolled Persians in his army, trained them in the Macedonian way, and at a single great ceremony married thousands of his soldiers to Asian brides. It was a vision far ahead of its age. On he pressed, over the mountains and down at last into India, into the valley of the Indus, into a green and unknown world of monsoon rains and strange gods and kings who rode to war on elephants. At a rain-swollen river he fought his last great battle, against an Indian king named Porus and his line of war elephants, and won it, but at a heavy cost in the hardest fighting of his life. He honored the brave Porus and gave him back his kingdom, and pressed on, hungry still for the eastern ocean he believed lay just beyond, at the edge of the world. But here, at last, the world said no to Alexander, not the enemy but his own men. For his soldiers had marched and fought, and bled beside him for 8 long years and many thousands of miles from home, and they were weary to the bone and homesick, and afraid of the endless lands ahead, and they would go no further. At a river in India, for the first and only time, the army of Alexander refused to follow him east. He raged and shut himself in his tent for days and pleaded. But the men would not yield, and in the end, for the only time in his life, Alexander turned back. He wept, they said, that there were no more worlds to conquer, but the truth was simpler and sadder. His men had had enough, and their great captain had, at last, to obey them. The road home was terrible. He led part of the army back through a burning desert, and thousands died of thirst and heat in the sand, more, perhaps, than had ever fallen to an enemy. He shared their sufferings. When a soldier brought him a helmet of precious water, he poured it out upon the ground rather than drink while his men could not. At last he came back to Babylon, master of the world, and there he made vast plans, new cities, new fleets, new conquests to the west and the south, the joining of his empire into one. But in the summer, in his 33rd year, after a long night of feasting, a fever took him and would not let go. For 10 days he sank, the fever burning higher, until he could no longer speak. His soldiers, distraught, filed past his bed one by one to look upon their captain a last time, and he could only move his eyes and his hand to greet them. When they asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered, they said, to the strongest. And then, still short of 33 years old, Alexander died. He had conquered the known world in a dozen years, and founded cities that still stand, and spread the Greek tongue and Greek ways from Egypt to the borders of India, farther than any man before him. And he had built no plan for what should come after. With his last breath, the greatest empire the world had ever seen was left to be fought over, to the strongest. And fought over it was. Alexander left no grown heir fit to rule, only an unborn child and a simple-minded half-brother, both soon murdered. So his great generals, the hard men who had marched with him, turned upon one another, and for 40 years they tore his empire apart in wars, each seizing what he could hold. When the dust of those long wars settled, the one empire of Alexander had broken into several great kingdoms, each ruled by the line of one of his generals, Macedon and Greece under one, the vast lands of Asia under another, the Seleucids, and rich Egypt under a third, the line of Ptolemy, who would rule from Alexandria for 300 years. We call this the Hellenistic Age, the age when Greek culture, spread by Alexander's conquests, was no longer the possession of small free cities, but the shared high culture of great kingdoms across half the world. From the Mediterranean to Afghanistan, kings and merchants and scholars now spoke Greek, and built Greek theaters and temples, and read Homer beneath foreign skies. It was an age less of freedom than of grandeur and learning. The little self-governing city, where every man had a voice, was gone. Men were subjects of kings again now, as their distant ancestors had been. But in exchange, the Greek world grew vast and rich and wonderfully curious about everything under the sun. And its brightest jewel was Alexandria in Egypt, the city Alexander had founded, now grown into the greatest city of the age, with its famous lighthouse towering over the harbor, one of the wonders of the world, guiding ships in by night with its great fire. There the kings of Egypt built something new in the history of the world, a great museum, a house of the muses, and beside it a library, and set out to gather into it every book that had ever been written, in any language, copied and translated and stored, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the collected knowledge of humankind, under one roof. And to that library and museum came the greatest scholars of the age, paid by the kings simply to study and to think. There Euclid set down the whole of geometry in a book so perfect it would be taught, almost unchanged, for 2,000 years. There a scholar measured the size of the round earth itself from the shadows of the noonday sun, and got it very nearly right. Elsewhere in that brilliant world, in Sicily, the greatest of all ancient scientists, Archimedes, weighed the crown and moved the water and understood the lever and the sphere, and cried out his Eureka, "I have found it," leaping from his bath. The Greeks, in this late age, came closer to true science than anyone would come again for a very long time. It was a splendid twilight, full of learning and art and wealth and wonder, of vast libraries and towering lighthouses and philosophers teaching men how to find peace in a world grown too large to control. But it was a twilight nonetheless. For the Greek kingdoms were forever at war with one another, dividing and weakening, spending their strength. And far to the west, all this while, a new and harder power had been rising. A city of stern and disciplined farmers and soldiers, patient and relentless and hungry for order, who had conquered all of Italy and now looked eastward, across the sea, toward the rich and quarreling and brilliant kingdoms of the Greeks. That city was Rome. Rome and the Greek world were drawn together slowly, at first as allies, then as rivals, then as master and subject. For all their genius, the Greeks could not unite even now against the newcomer. City set against city, king against king, and each in turn called in Roman help against its neighbors, and so let the wolf inside the fold. The Roman legions, in their patient, flexible ranks, proved more than a match even for the great pike phalanx that Alexander had wielded. Kingdom by kingdom, war by war, the Greek powers were beaten down and swallowed. Macedon, the homeland of Alexander, was conquered and made a Roman province. And in one bitter year, to teach the Greeks obedience, the Romans utterly destroyed the ancient and wealthy city of Corinth, burning it, killing or enslaving its people, and carrying its treasures away to Italy. It was a warning, and it was understood. The age of Greek freedom was, at long last, truly over. The proud cities of the old days, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, still stood, honored now as ancient monuments, as museums of a glorious past. Young Romans came to Athens to study philosophy at the feet of Greek teachers. Roman generals walked the sacred ground with awe. But they came now as rulers, and the Greeks served under them. The last of the great Greek kingdoms to fall was Egypt, ruled to the end by the line of Ptolemy, and its last ruler was its most famous, the clever and charming Queen Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, who spoke a dozen tongues and dreamed of restoring the greatness of her house by binding herself to the masters of Rome. But she had staked her throne on the losing side of Rome's own civil wars, and when her cause was beaten and the Roman fleet closed in, she chose to die a queen rather than be led in chains through the streets of Rome, and with her died the last Greek kingdom, and 3 centuries of the line of Alexander's general came quietly to an end. And so the whole Greek world passed under the rule of Rome. Yet something strange and wonderful happened in that conquest, for as one poet said, captive Greece took her fierce conqueror captive. The Romans, who had beaten the Greeks in war, knelt to them in everything else, in art, in poetry, in philosophy, in the very shape of their gods. The Romans took the Greek gods and gave them Latin names. They learned from Greek philosophy and copied Greek statues and studied Greek science. They carried the Greek inheritance to the far ends of their vast empire, to lands the Greeks themselves had never seen. Greece had lost her freedom, but her mind had conquered the conqueror, and through Rome would conquer the world. And so, at the last, we come to the strange and quiet truth of it. The Greeks lost. Their cities fell. Their freedom ended. Their kingdoms were swallowed one by one. In the hard arithmetic of empire, they were beaten and they passed away. And yet, in every way that lasts, they won, for we are still so largely their heirs. Look around you even now. When you vote, the word is Greek, and so is the idea. When you go to the theater or read a tragedy, they made it. Our philosophy and our science, our geometry and our logic, our very habit of asking why, of trusting reason to explain the world, all of it was born on those small stony hills above the wine-dark sea. Their marble temples still stand, half-broken, golden in the evening light, more beautiful in ruin than most things are whole. Their poems are still read. Their questions are still asked. Their plays are still performed. 25 centuries after that small, quarrelsome, brilliant people lived and argued and dreamed, we are still, in 1,000 quiet ways, living inside the world they imagined. And now the temple on its high rock grows dark against the stars, and the long day of Greece is done. Let it rest, and let the wine-dark sea grow still, and let the old gods sleep upon their mountain. There is nothing now to do but rest. Let your breathing slow, and your thoughts grow quiet, and let the whole long story carry you gently down at last into sleep. Good night.